Hello, this is the third and final video in my 3 videos on social and political philosophy as part of my series going through philosophy from at least one Christian perspective. There's not just one Christian perspective on these things, I suspect, but I'm trying to give you one particular perspective. And of course, I am from the Wesleyan tradition, so it is what we might call an Arminian perspective. Of course, I'm not limited to that. I mix together things because all truth is God's truth, right? But enough introduction. What is economics? Well, economics has to do with the way in which possessions and goods and money and the way property and the way people interact with each other in terms of material type things often. The word economy comes from the word for household. So anyway, but we often think when we talk about economics, we often think about the way money works. And so that gives you a good sense of where we might be going with this. And hopefully you'll get pretty quickly a sense of what kinds of things are covered under economic philosophy. I want to start with the Bible because this is not just a philosophy video, but it's also a Christian philosophy video, and Christians care about the Bible, allegedly. So let's start with it, the Bible. The Old Testament was an agrarian economy. You had your land. It was a land that was passed down from generation to generation to generation. It was your family's land. You didn't move to, let's move to Chattanooga. That didn't happen. People pretty much stayed where they were, and families, of course, reproduced, and there wasn't enough room, on the original plot, no doubt. But there was a tendency of inherited, well, that my father lived here, his father lived here, his father lived here, and so forth. Although families, as we saw in the social philosophy video, the family was not just a nuclear family, but an extended family, even building into clans and tribes and so forth. But it was an agrarian economy. And I want to make something clear here, that there is a tendency sometimes. So, you have Christian thinkers who talk about how to manage your money, or they talk about what are some biblical principles for how to manage your money and that sort of thing. And sometimes when those things are built on big pictures, so like Ron Blue talks about God owns it all. Absolutely, God owns it all. So when you build on those big boulders, the big principles, that's when you're safest on this. But if you get down into details like don't take out a loan, make sure you have all the money before you start a building project. A lot of times those are built upon instructions in the Old Testament that related to ancient Israel. Well, let me tell you, ancient Israel was very, very, very different from the modern stock market kind of not tied to the gold standard kind of economy we have. The economy we have in the Western world is very different from the ancient farming kind of economy. And so to simply take an instruction out of the Old Testament and because none of those comments of the Old Testament or the New Testament for that matter were made in a bubble. They were made in a context. Words have meanings in context. And so to simply pull a verse out of the Old Testament and say, and we're going to apply this to the modern Western world, that's foolhardy, really. It's actually ignorant, because you're not paying attention to the differences between their context and our context. And so there is, I'm going to say it right now, there is no biblical prohibition on a church taking out a loan to do a building project. Now, of course, a church should be very wise about how they go about doing that. There should be a lot of sound judgment involved in that. But there is no biblical prohibition that applies in a straightforward way to today, because we simply live in a different economic structure than ancient Israel. It was a different kind of place. For one thing, in our world, in theory, the gross domestic product can get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. It's not tied, our money is tied to the gross domestic product, not to how much gold we have in Fort Knox or anything like that. And so in theory, it can get bigger and bigger. The ancient world, as I'll show in a second, tended to think more of a finite amount of good, that we kind of trade back and forth. the idea that everybody could, be rich, which doesn't seem to happen. But I mean, the idea that a lot of people could prosper materially, that simply was not the understanding of any of the biblical times or cultures. And so those things have to be taken into account when we're moving from that time to our time. The ancient world of the Old Testament especially was a farming world, an agrarian world. And of course, Deuteronomy tends to say, if you keep God's commands, you'll be blessed in the land. If you don't keep God's command, you'll be cursed in the land. We find out we have to, of course, read all of Scripture. You don't just take a Scripture and apply it directly to today without consulting the whole counsel of God in the rest of Scripture. So, for example, sometimes this is a general truth, but it's not an always truth, because sometimes good people like Job, see, the whole counsel of God. Sometimes good people like Job lose everything. And so just because you went bankrupt doesn't mean you're an evil person necessarily. It might mean that. No, it probably doesn't mean that. But so we have to take the context of these statements into account, because the Deuteronomistic, as it's called, parts of the Old Testament do have a kind of prosperity gospel, but it has to be balanced with Job. It has to be balanced with Isaiah 53, where a righteous man suffers. And of course, it especially has to be balanced with the New Testament. Of course, in the Old Testament, there's a year of Jubilee every 50 years, reset button hit, and all the property goes back to the original families. We do not know if this was actually practiced in ancient Israel. We don't know for sure if it was or not. Sometimes laws in the ancient Near East, I'm not talking specifically about the New Testament now, Old Testament now, but sometimes in the ancient Near East, laws were kind of more like position papers than actual things that were policed. And so it's not entirely sure that the year of Jubilee was ever actually practiced in ancient Israel. So as I mentioned, in the New Testament, to understand, the New Testament is very negative toward wealth and the hoarding of wealth. The book of Luke is not positive toward wealth. James, not positive at all toward wealth. And again, so if you could have one extreme for those who take the Old Testament without considering context, you could have another kind of communist extreme from the New Testament that basically says nobody should have any accumulation at all. But again, the New Testament world is a little bit different from our world, and that has to be taken into account when we are applying Scripture. They had a sense of limited good. What does that mean? It means that there are only so many apples to go around. So let's say that there are 100 apples and there are 100 people. Well, each individual could have an apple, but if I leave with 50 of the apples, there's only one way I got 50 of the apples, and that is that I took it from 49 other people. So wealth is, there's an old Arab proverb that every rich person is either a thief or the son of a thief. So this is a very prevalent attitude toward wealth in the ancient world, and it's often based upon this sense of there only being a limited amount of good to go around. So let me give you some examples from the New Testament. Woe to you who are rich, you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, you're going to be hungry. Okay, not very positive. And you may know Matthew's version of this beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit. But that's not the way Luke records it. Luke has, blessed are you poor, period, and woe to you who are rich, period, as it were. So here's James. Come now, you rich people. Weep, wail for the miseries coming on you. Your riches have rotted, your clothes are moth-eaten, your gold and silver have rusted. Their rust will be evidence against you. It will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure for the last days. Pretty harsh, but you see what I'm saying is that the New Testament is not positive toward wealth. Not really. 1 Timothy 6, love of money is the root of all evil. This is, of course, the ideal of Luke. Luke portrays this nature of the early church. He portrays it as an ideal. All came upon everyone, because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles, and all who believed were together, and they had all things in common. They would sell their extra possessions, I assume here. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to everybody as they had need. Sounds like communism. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home, they ate the food with glad and generous hearts, praising God, having the goodwill of all the people, and day by day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. Well, there have been movements in history who have taken this exactly for what it seems to say, and they have sold all their extra stuff, and they have lived in a community, and have nobody's called their property their own. They've shared it, and if you, oh, I've got an extra apple here, you take it. But of course, what we've found historically is that these movements don't last very long. There was a famous one in Chicago, ended up moving to, I think, Waukesha, Wisconsin, eventually, but they were called the Holy Jumpers. And they did this. There was one of the founders of the community was a hotel owner, and he sold all his hotels. Well, if he hadn't have sold his hotels, they'd have been able to go on for who knows how long. But because there was no money coming into the community, they survived as long as they did by basically getting people when they died to donate their property to the organization. Well, it just didn't work. And so this works if you think the end times, and of course he did. They thought that Jesus was coming back any moment. And probably the early church thought that Jesus was coming back any moment as well. This is great. The spirit of Acts 2 is great, but it's probably not a society level long-term strategy, to survive. And this is again where we basically have to take into account that time and that context and figure out, how does it relate to our time and our context. Basically, we're going to have to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, Philippians 2:12. We're going to have to wrestle with these issues together. We're going to have to figure out what's the best way to apply biblical principles in our time, taking into account the whole counsel of God and not just one passage, and not forgetting that this was not written to us. It was written to people who've been dead for 2,000 years. And so there's hard work involved in applying the Bible. It's not as easy as a lot of people make it out to be. It takes work. We have to do it with the right heart too, because if we don't have the right heart, then of course it's easy to completely twist scripture in the way we apply it today. Okay, well, there's a little bit about some biblical perspectives and aspects of this question of economy. And one of our main conclusions is both the Old and the New Testament were written for quite different worlds. When Jesus says, "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar," there is actually a sense in which Jesus is saying, well, okay, you're asking me whether I should give this coin to Caesar? Well, let me look at it. Okay, whose picture is on this coin? Oh, it's Caesar's picture. Well, you better give that back to him. In other words, the world of coinage, the world of money, that has nothing to do with the kingdom of God. Give to Caesar whatever whatever coins he wants, because the kingdom of God doesn't consist of that sort of thing. And of course, the world of Jesus was much more of a barter world, a trade world, than it was an actual money kind of world. It was not a monetary society at the time of Christ. When did Jesus come into contact with money? Well, basically when he had to pay taxes. There's a temple tax, a half shekel tax for the temple. There was Roman tax. There was toll tax. Matthew, the tax collector, probably sat at a toll, and when you were moving from one region to the next, you had to pay him a toll. And so it was not the kind of world, that we are in terms of economics. That has to be taken into account when we identify biblical principles and try to play them out today. Well, let's talk about capitalism, shall we? Capitalism in the Bible? No, not really. Capitalism is a modern invention that arose in the 1700s. So there has been in the United States especially a certain kind of fusion between capitalism and Christianity. It's really fascinating that there are a lot of American Christians who, if you question capitalism, they think you're questioning the Bible and you're questioning Jesus. Well, of course, no. Capitalism came about from Adam Smith in the 1700s. And I've heard things like, thou shalt not steal. Obviously, they were capitalists. Well, what are the limits of that statement? You can't shove all of our issues about money into thou shalt not steal. What did thou shalt not steal mean in ancient Israel? It means don't come into my house and take my stuff. But when you get into economies and economic systems where things are they happen completely different. We're not talking about you coming in and taking one of my books. You're talking about a system that multiplies money and so forth. And I think it's a whole different ball game. Certainly, it's not a ball game that the Bible anticipated. And so to say, thou shalt not steal, therefore there shouldn't be any taxes, man, that doesn't follow at all. Doesn't follow at all. And of course, the New Testament, as we saw in the political philosophy video tells Christians to pay their taxes. So anyway, the Bible was not written to us. It says so, right? I mean, if you take the Bible literally, it says it was written to people who are dead for a long time. Ancient Israelites, Romans, Thessalonians, Corinthians, okay? So when we apply the Bible, even thou shalt not steal, it has to be, thou shalt not steal had a meaning in ancient Israel. And that's our starting point. You can't just take that, put it on the wall and apply it to the redistribution of excess in the 21st century. It just doesn't work that way. Well, let's talk about capitalism. The roots of modern capitalism were in utilitarianism, which if you look at the ethics videos, utilitarianism is basically the greatest good for the greatest number. And so also part of utilitarianism, remember who started utilitarianism? That's right, Jeremy Bentham. And the idea was everybody counts the same. I think it's important for us to realize what was the goal. What was the goal of capitalism when it arose in the 1700s? The goal of capitalism in 1700s was not to make a few people filthy rich. In fact, the goal was exactly the opposite. Because at the time when Jeremy Bentham and Adam Smith, the founder of capitalism, when these guys were kicking around in the 1700s, you had the aristocracy who had land and who had lots of wealth. And then you had the poor people, who basically, lived off the land in some phases of history, or maybe in a coal mine in the 1700s when the Industrial Revolution started. And so the purpose of utilitarianism was to distribute wealth to everybody. And of course, it was connected to work, of course. But the goal of capitalism was to even out prosperity so that everybody was prosperous. Sure, you can expect with capitalism for some people to have more than others. That will be a natural byproduct of capitalism. But the goal was not to create a few 20 people who own all the world's wealth, and everybody else is, pennies. That was actually the opposite of the goal. The goal of Adam Smith and Jeremy Bentham was to level out the playing field. And the way they thought that you could do that is by letting everybody start a business. And so the goal for capitalism was even things out. And the way to do that, they believed, is you had to get rid of ignorance and superstition. And of course, they thought religion was superstition. Jeremy Bentham, as you recall from previous video, he gave his money to the University of London, I think it was, on the condition that they display his stuffed body at board meetings. And you can still see his head in a case, I think, in the University of London. But he didn't believe in God. He didn't believe in the afterlife. And so Bentham, he's put my dead body on display so people aren't so superstitious about things that we shouldn't be afraid of, like death. And so the importance of education arises in this background. Why do we have the rise of public education? Public education arises because you can't have good voters if they're not educated, and you can't have a good people have to know what's in their best interest in order for this system to work. The goal is the empowerment of everybody. And so education becomes very important. The basis of capitalism is in what we call egoism. See previous video. The idea is that people are selfish, or at least people are self-interested. And so people are going to do what's going to maximize their own pleasure. People are going to do what's going to maximize their own self-interest. And so the idea is that if everybody is trying to get what's best for them, we'll meet in the middle. So for example, if I'm selling you something on Amazon, I'm going to try to pick, or a house, say we're trying to sell my house, let's say. So we want to charge as much as we can get, but we don't want to charge so much that we're not going to get anybody. And so there's this give and take. The buyer wants to pay as little as possible. The seller wants to get as much as possible. And so the idea is that we'll meet somewhere in the middle where I'm getting as much as I can and you're paying as little as I can, and we've met somewhere in the middle. And so the basic underlying principle of capitalism is that people are going to follow what's in their own self-interest. It's a kind of a selfish philosophy, capitalism is. And of course, it works because of the fallen nature of humanity. Capitalism works because of sin. Now, it's not entirely sin, because I do think that God built ambition into the creation, right? God, why else would Adam go for knowledge in the Garden of Eden if there wasn't some, because he doesn't have a sin nature, right? So there must be some drive to excellence that's part of humanity, a drive to be all you can be, and so forth. And so I don't want to say that this drive for self-excellence is entirely sinful, but let's just say that it is heavily sinful. Selfishness is heavily sinful. And so capitalism works in large part because of the fallen sinfulness of humanity. But that's a reality. It's a reality we have to take into account. The dreamy kind of communes of Karl Marx don't exist, or if they do exist, they die very quickly. People are self-interested. People are selfish generally. And so capitalism works because of that, because this is the way it is. It is a economy for a fallen world, I would say. So Adam Smith was the founder of capitalism, and he said that basically when we set up a system like this, we will even out in this kind of optimal setup as if by an unseen hand, almost as if God is doing it, Adam Smith said. The idea again is that because we're competing against each other in our best interest, we will arrive at a price that maximizes the benefit to both of us. And so again, what is the goal of capitalism? The goal is of spreading out prosperity across everybody, and not just locating it in a few aristocracy people or oligarchy, as we said in the political philosophy video, or the right now the filthy rich. I mean, there are currently a number of billionaires. They're almost all white, or most of them are white. But right now, wealth is concentrated in a very few individuals. Well, that just messes it all up. Capitalism doesn't work if everything is run by a few, just a very small number. Then we're just back to the same aristocracy we had before the Industrial Revolution. So, by the way, you might be surprised to know what this philosophy of Adam Smith, how it was characterized in the 1700s. It was called the free enterprise system. Why free? Because we're going to let people start businesses, and we're going to let people charge whatever they want to charge. And so I've got a Greek Bible here. I'm going to sell it to you for $10,000. Now I guarantee you nobody's going to buy my Greek Bible for $10,000, but I'm free to charge that. But if I'm smart, I'm not going to charge that if I really want to sell it. I don't. This is one of my favorite Greek New Testaments. But let's say I really wanted to sell it. Well, I wouldn't. Maybe $10, $15. I'm not selling it. But free enterprise means that anybody can start a business. I can start a business. Look at this video. This video is on YouTube. I get a few pennies because I put an advertisement in front of it. And if you watch some of the advertisement, then I get ching, ching, ching. I get some pennies for having this video on YouTube. It's free enterprise. It's also called laissez-faire. economics, which is French for to allow to do. The idea is that you just let everybody start businesses, let everybody charge whatever they want, let everybody buy whatever they want, and as if by an unseen hand, Adam Smith said, it will all meet in the middle and will have an optimal thing for everybody. This is also called classical liberalism, which may be a little shocking because you know, a lot of times we talk about those liberal communists, you know, or whatever, pinko communists. And so liberalism is sometimes associated more with socialism or communism today. But liberalism in the 1700s meant freedom, liberal. I'm a liberal giver. I give freely. Liberation is to free somebody. And so it was also called classical liberalism because, you know, people were free to charge what they want and start whatever business they want. So the laws of supply and demand is kind of the underlying theme of what part of what I've been talking about. So if you've got lots and lots of a supply of something, people aren't going to pay much for it, like water. You're not going to get a lot of money for water. Now somehow we've convinced ourselves we need bottled water, and in Houghton, New York, I think we do. But this idea, and in Flint, Michigan, I think they definitely did. Hopefully they've solved some of the water crisis there. But when you've got lots of a thing, you're not going to get a lot of money for it. If I say, here, I've got some air in a bottle, you know, I'm not going to get any money for air in a bottle unless we're in outer space and we're about to run out of air. So demand, as the demand goes up, the price goes up, and as the supply goes up, the price goes down. And so this law of supply and demand tends to be a formula for the unseen hand, and how it all maximizes that I don't pay any more than I have to, and you don't charge any more, that you charge as much as you can charge. So here's some of the basics of the idea of capitalism. Like I said, Adam Smith in the 1700s was the father of capitalism. So let me just review and summarize what we've been saying here. He said people are rational. Not really. But anyway, he said in a perfect world, people are rational. They are self-interested. Again, not always. I'm gonna be a little blunt here. I know some people who would benefit greatly from universal health care. I know some people who would benefit greatly from universal health care, and yet I think they're deathly opposed to it. Why? Because of this ideology that they've been fed over the years. No, that's bad. But so really, if they were self-interested, they would be in favor of universal health care, but their ideas have gotten in the way, and they're not. So I don't think that people are nearly as rational as Adam Smith thought they were. But I get what he's saying, that people are reasonable and they do often what is in their best interest, or what they think is in their best interest. And so if we let everything go, we let people charge what they're going to charge and buy what they want to buy and sell whatever they want to sell, that if we let go laissez-faire, to allow to do free enterprise, if we let it all go, then we keep the government out of it, he would say, no regulations, then a system that's beneficial to all will evolve by the laws of supply and demand. Now, I think I'm going to argue in a second, and I realize there are those who disagree. I think I'm representing probably what the majority of economists would say. Not everybody agrees with what I'm saying, true. But I would say, I don't think I'm saying anything that's wacko in this video. I think that I'm pretty much representing what the majority of economists would say. And here's what I would say on this one, that zero government intervention is bad. It didn't turn out the way, as we'll see in a second, capitalism didn't turn out the way Adam Smith thought it would, that there needs to be some regulation in order for it to work. Otherwise, we'll have the things that Karl Marx predicted, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. So I'm very much in favor of capitalism. If that's in doubt, I consider myself a modified capitalist, or a regulated capitalist, or a moderate capitalist. I don't know what you want to call it, but I believe that capitalism, a carefully regulated capitalism, I believe, is the best way for maximal human thriving. I agree with that. I believe that. I'll make it clear. I find some of the things that again, you don't have to agree with me at all. Please feel free to disagree with me. I'm going to share. Now Ken's going to share. I find this is 2020 when I'm making this video. I find some of the proposals of a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren or what is it, Ocasio-Cortez, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. I find some of their proposals very, very concerning. And they're not the boogeyman to me, okay? I'm not saying, oh, evil liberals. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I do find some of their thinking concerning because I don't think that will maximize human thriving. And by the same token, I would find some of the ideas of the Koch brothers or of the hyper-capitalists. I find what the Republican Congress, the tax breaks that they provided under the Trump administration, I find concerning. I'm considering myself an independent, just to put my cards on the table here. I'm neither hot nor cold. I'm neither Republican nor Democrat. I'll let you decide which one's hot and which one's cold. I'm telling you this because I believe that capitalism, in fact, is, as long as it is carefully watched, and it must be carefully watched, I do believe that it is the best way to maximize human thriving. But you have to be very careful, as we'll see, because John Stuart Mill, coming after Adam Smith, had some modifications that he felt needed to be taken into view. Let me just tell you a little bit about John Stuart Mill for a second. He lived in the early 1800s. His father's name was James Mill, who was a groupie of Jeremy Bentham. So his dad had high hopes for his son, that his son would carry the torch of utilitarianism into the 1800s. And he did. I mean, John Stuart Mill was the torchbearer of utilitarianism into the 1800s. But he probably disappointed his father a little bit. I don't remember how long his father lived into the 1800s. But his father had high hopes that he would carry the torch of Bentham, but Mill did, but with some modifications. In the end, Mill couldn't totally agree with the way that Adam Smith laid out capitalism and the way that Jeremy Bentham laid out utilitarianism. Poor guy had a nervous breakdown. His father, James, just basically pressured him really severely as a child to learn. I think he learned Greek and Latin when he was 8, which is fine. There's nothing wrong. It's good for some. But he had a nervous breakdown, I think, around when he turned 20. And when he emerged from the nervous breakdown, he was still a utilitarian. He was still a capitalist, but a somewhat modified in the manner that I'm talking about here. So, for example, Mill decided that, well, not all pleasures are equal. And so this was one of Jeremy Bentham's premises, that all pleasures count the same. And Mill said, well, I'm not sure that that's actually the case. Mill also recognized that people don't always act in their best interest, especially when it comes to the short-term versus the long-term situation. I mean, take retirement accounts, 401ks. If you normally a business doesn't let you tap into your 401k. And this is good, right? Because that means your 401k grows and grows and grows. If we could just tap into our 401ks anytime, I guarantee you we would all whittle, well, not all, but a lot of us would whittle them away by, I want to go on vacation. I'm just going to take $1,000 out of my 401k. And so people don't always act in their best interest. And John Stuart Mill recognized this. And of course, they especially don't act in their own interest if they don't have good information. And in an internet world, or in a world where you can travel 1,000 miles and just stop for a day at a place, having good information is important. How many stars does this hotel have? What does the Better Business Bureau say about this company that I'm going to order something from? And so having these kinds of guards and these kinds of controls are important. The saga, look it up sometime, the saga of banning leaded gasoline and leaded paint took decades. It took decades to abolish lead paint in porches and things like that. The science was known for a very, very long time. Why did it not pass Congress when it was completely obvious to anybody with knowledge that leaded paint caused brain damage in children? You know, and this sort of thing. Why didn't it? Because of money. Because capitalism had its grubby hands on the senators. I believe the same thing is, you know, going on now with climate change. The science is not ambiguous in the slightest. Those who are experts on these things say climate change is absolutely real. So why have we not passed laws? Well, some of it is ideology, but I think some of it is money, 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 money. And so this is the way things happen. Take Flint, Michigan, you know, where the water was horribly bad. So there have to be regulations on business. Have to be, because if you let selfish human nature be free, as Adam Smith thought, then a whole lot of bad things are going to happen. And of course, Upton Sinclair in the, I believe it was the late 1800s, maybe early 1900s as well, Upton Sinclair wrote a novel called The Jungle. Now, of course, it was a muckraker, but it wasn't completely crazy. He talks about a man who works in a leaf lard factory, and he falls into a vat, and nobody ever finds him. He just goes out packaged as leaf lard into the world. It is important for there to be regulations on business, because people don't do the right thing most of the time when money is involved. There have to be regulations, or else it'll all go amok. I'm not saying it has to be, see, this is a spectrum. It's not all or nothing. There, you can have 50%, you can have 40%. You see what I'm saying? It's not an all or nothing thing, but there have to be controls on capitalism, because capitalism is a monster that will eat all but the top if it's allowed to just do whatever it wants, especially in a world that's quite different from the world that Adam Smith knew, the internet world, for example. So what was Karl Marx's critique of capitalism in the middle 1800s, say 1849-ish, when the Communist Manifesto came out? So he thought it was, first of all, he thought it was irrational, because capitalism produces stuff, but it doesn't distribute it. So there was a period of time when the government actually paid farmers to store their grain and not to sell it, because there was just way too much of it. And Marx would say, well, that doesn't make any sense. You got hungry people and you got a lot of grain. Why don't you feed them? I mean, I understand the logic of all that, but you know, there is a certain illogic to some of these things. You could have 10 Big Macs left over at the end of the day, and in some places it would be policy, you can't give those 10 Big Macs away because it messes the system up. Now, I understand the system, but this was one of Karl Marx's critiques. Karl Marx also said that capitalism alienates people from work. Who wants to work in a factory where you're oppressed? Now, I actually think Marx was a little silly here, not entirely, but I think he was a little silly, because he's like, people want to work, let them do what they want, let them work, but let them work the way they want. Well, I think, you know, you'd have a lot of people who were actors, you know, or something, or people who, I want to work as a, I don't know, something that doesn't actually benefit anybody. I want to work as a painter. I'm going to paint stuff. So I do think there has to be a little bit of assignment of work, or there has to be some distribution of work, because not everybody's going to want to clean toilets. You know, who wants to clean toilets? There are probably some people that like to clean toilets, but I don't think there's anybody who, well, I don't think there are many people who would say, what I want, if I could do anything wanted to do, I would clean toilets. There aren't that many people like that. But I do think Marx was right, that especially before there were labor laws, you know, where you might have a child who goes into a coal mine before light comes up, and the child comes out of the coal mine after it's dark, and the child has a horrible, miserable, I mean, having child labor laws, that makes sense, right? And of course, slavery. Why did slavery go on for so long? Well, because it was free labor, right? I mean, these are people who work and I don't have to pay them anything. It's very hard making, you know, cotton. And so capitalism has over time facilitated evils in the world. Again, I'm not saying capitalism therefore, you know, should be done away with. No, I think that I have hope that capitalism can be moderated in a way to where its excesses don't see themselves out. And of course, this fits in with what I was saying. He said capitalism debases workers, and it has. I mean, in the late 1800s, or in the time when Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, I think it's quite clear. Today we have workman's compensation. You know, if you get injured on the job, you're not well. There goes your salary. I mean, you have some salary. Um, People can debate minimum wage amounts and so forth, but the idea of people being able to earn a living wage at whatever job they're doing, I mean, it's a good idea. I mean, but we have to work out the details, right? So Karl Marx was not entirely crazy with some of these critiques he made of capitalism. Here is his goal. His goal was that we would get from each person their ability, what they can do, and then we would give to each person according to their need. Again, not realistic. In my opinion, this just doesn't work, because people are not motivated, by and large, people are not motivated if they don't receive a reward for what they do. I mean, if people don't get the benefit of their work, they're not going to be motivated to work. Now, there are people who just, I like to work anyway. I'm that way with teaching. If I didn't have to grade, I'd teach for free. I mean, I'm teaching for free here, really. And so this idea that if we have everybody do what they can do, and then we only give it in accordance with need, that's going to demotivate everybody. And again, I'll go on record right here that Eastern Europe was a mess under communism. Soviet Union was a mess under communism. I went to Germany in 1995, I think it was. It might have been 94. And I saw the difference between West Berlin and what used to be East Berlin. And let me just say that East Berlin was ugly and blab and depressing. And Eastern Europe was not a place of thriving, even though they were trying to follow. They didn't quite get there, but they were trying to follow something like this. We'll have everybody work according to what the government assigns, and then we'll give everybody the same in return. It doesn't motivate anybody. People are motivated by being able to get the fruits of their labor. And so, in a way, what Marx was looking for here was in some ways a very Christian kind of setup, right? You know, I'm going to work and I'm going to give everything I have, you know, away. I mean, that's not unchristian. Let's be very clear. That's not an unchristian vision, but it doesn't work in the world, because the world is fallen and the world is sinful. And so it just doesn't work. Communism is a failure and has been a failure, and communism will always be a failure. Soviet Union these places didn't even get to communism. They never got beyond the state controlling everything, because again, the state hoarded the wealth to itself. Anyway, okay, so let me talk about some more of Marx's fantasies. So Marx saw history as what we call a dialectic. Hegel is a philosopher that you should have heard of in a philosophy course. Marx took Hegel and made him his own. Hegel's not completely wrong. Hegel's idea was history often progresses with you have this candidate, or in this corner we have fighter number one, and in this corner we have fighter number two, and they fight together, and what comes out is the best of both of them. So you have a thesis and an antithesis. They clash with each other, and what emerges is pieces of both, the best of both, and now we have a new synthesis that becomes a new thesis, and then it has an antithesis. Boom, synthesis. That becomes a thesis, antithesis, synthesis, boom. And of course, Hegel thought this was all headed toward something he called absolute spirit. Crazy. But Marx took these ideas and applied it to material things. And so he said, originally we had kings and slaves. The kings had absolute power, the slaves had no power. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. We had lords. The lords didn't have as much power as kings did, but the serfs under them had more power than slaves. So we have thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Now we have the merchant class, the business people who have resources, and you have workers who are under them. You have the the merchants, the bourgeoisie. If you've ever heard, oh, that's bougie, that comes from bourgeoisie. And then you have the workers, the proletariat. And what happens is thesis, antithesis. Then he thought we would come to a classless society. Oh, there you go, bringing class into it again. But of course, that's crazy. It never happened, never will happen. Marx's sense of the inevitable dialectic of history it's just crazy. It's not going to happen. And as I said, his vision of the end, communism, doesn't work. And so, again, he has some critiques. He has some valid critiques, I believe. But ultimately, a modified or a moderated capitalism, I think, is the best bet for human thriving. Socialism to communism never happened. Like I said, the state in the USSR never said, okay, we're done being in charge. We're going to let everybody now just be workers. It didn't happen. And it's never going to happen. The only place this will ever work is in very, very small communities like Shakertown or Oneida, New York back in the day. By the way, John Wesley led a revival in England that helped abolish child labor laws and I think, was part of a trajectory that did away with slavery in England. And Karl Marx, England helped Karl Marx modify his theory. He thought it would all end in bloody revolution, that the workers, the proletariats would overthrow the bourgeoisie in a bloody revolution, and it would lead to a classless society. And there was a wave of revolutions in 1849. And of course, in 1914, there was the communist, was it 14 or no, I'm sorry, in 1917, there was the Lenin communist revolution, Bolshevik revolution in Russia. But Marx did modify. He said, okay, there might be some places like England where the end game of communism might happen without a bloody revolution. But of course, it never happened. Okay, so Karl Marx is a little bit crazy, but he's not entirely wrong. Not entirely wrong. And I think there were some industrial revolution corrections that took place. So Adam Smith could not have imagined the scale of capitalism after the Industrial Revolution. And what ended up happening is we went right back to having these steel barons and these really filthy rich people who ran the railroads and ran everything. And so you had monopolies. Well, Joe Ken can't go start a business. It's very hard for me to compete with Walmart. You know, let's say that I put a stand out in front of Walmart. Well, probably the police are going to shoo me off. But I mean, it's very hard to compete with Amazon. And of course, a lot of bookstores have gone out of business, you know, and so forth. How do you compete with a mega business? And so Adam Smith could not have imagined the scale. So we have antitrust laws that came up in the late 1800s that basically no one business can have a monopoly on a particular sector or on a particular kind of good. Again, the goal of it was not massive individual wealth. The goal was not social Darwinism. Well, I'm the fittest, otherwise why would I have all this money? I must be better than you. You must be a loser and a sucker because I am the one that has all the money. You know, I don't even want to shake your hand. The goal was not that. The goal was maximum happiness. And so I think it's very important because we lose sight of that in these discussions today. What is the goal of a good economic system in a democracy? And the goal is maximum thriving for everybody, not the accumulation of wealth for a few. And like I said, monopolies threatened the competition. We had price gouging rules. So let's say that there's a horrible blizzard, and there's only one store that sells, you know, I don't know, heaters, and all the heat is out, and they sell kerosene heaters or something. I'm just making it up. And normally they're $5, but the guy says, I'm charging $5,000 for a lantern, you know, or whatever. That's price gouging, and it's against the law. Very hard to enforce, I'm sure. But these regulations, why are regulations important? To make sure that capitalism works the way that it's supposed to work. I would argue, and again, you may know more than I do, but I don't think I'm saying anything crazy. I would argue that the 2008 economic recession came because of the lack of regulation. People would sell debt and bundle it and sell debt and bundle it, and the housing crisis, to where you had all of these unsecured ownerships of debt packages with nothing to back them up. Well, it all collapsed. And so you might argue that deregulation is what led to this. And of course, regulations were put in at the beginning of the Obama administration, and those regulations have recently been peeled back. Well, what does that mean? It means that we're just begging for trouble again, in my opinion. Again, feel free to engage this critically. I don't want you to just buy what I'm saying, but I do want you to have an open mind, and feel free to push back and to debate these things. But again, I'm not saying stuff that's out of the ordinary among economists. Obscene wealth and power undermines the system, and we have to remember the system is set up for money to flow in certain directions. It's not stealing to have a higher tax rate for the filthy rich than for those on the bottom. That's not stealing. This is a system. It's a system the Bible couldn't possibly, the people in the Bible couldn't possibly have imagined anything this complex or this huge. Not that they weren't as smart as us, but it just didn't exist. And so this economic system has to be directed. The traffic of money has to be directed in such a way that money and power and thriving is distributed. It doesn't have to be distributed the same, which is what Marx saw. I'm not arguing for that. I'm not arguing against millionaires. I'm basically saying is that it needs to be distributed some, or else it just won't work. In a capitalist system, wealth is not straightforward. It's not the straightforward possession of goods, but it is a structure that causes money to flow in certain directions. And capitalism just won't do what it's supposed to do if the traffic signals are not very, very carefully thought through. So, what are my takeaways from Marx? One of my takeaways from Marx is that a lot of times it's about the money. Follow the money. It's not so much the ideas. We have these ideas and we have these debates about ideas, and we're up in the clouds talking about ideas. And Marx would say, it has nothing to do with the ideas. It has to do with the money, has to do with the material possessions. Now, sometimes it is about the ideas, but sometimes, a lot of times, it is about the money. Let me just tell you about a conversation I had these last 2 weeks. The question was, why is it that so many Christians believe that Christianity should only be about getting people saved and have nothing to do with actually helping people? And my response was, it goes back to the fundamentalist modernist controversy in the 1900s, where basically there were some liberals who said, there is no God, but we need to help people. And the conservative says, well, we do need to help people. There is a God. And then they left off that we had to help people. And so the way that I was kind of trained to think about the fundamentalist modernist controversy in the 1920s, for example, is that one side went to one extreme, we only need to help people. And so the other side went to the other extreme, we only need to serve God. And it's both. That's what I thought. Well, then a historian pointed out that, there's another layer to this. And that's the layer of business people who didn't want the money flowing to the poor. And that there is actually a book, it's called The Business Turn in Theology, or something like that. In history, the business turn in history, basically saying that, you can talk about those ideas, Ken, but ultimately it came down to people who didn't want money going in certain places. Now, maybe it's a both and on that particular one, but I do think it's true that it's like, is climate change really is the opposition to climate change really about science? Probably not. My guess is it's actually about money. And so this is why the Bible has such stern warnings about money. I do agree with Marx that unbridled capitalism can be very unstable. Look at the Great Depression. Look at the Great Recession. And who knows what we're headed for now if we continue to take all the regulations off of business today. I'm guessing it won't be pretty. And also, I think Marx was right that group power dynamics that involve domination in society, that they are very real. They're inescapable, I think. I don't think we can go to a leaderless society. I don't think that's going to ever happen. And I don't treat these power dynamics as rigidly, probably, as some neo-Marxist might. But the fact that those in power tend to oppress those who aren't in power, I think, again, it goes back to sinful human nature. Well, I want to end this video. It's gone on a long time. And I want to make a plea that there is a spectrum. It's not a this or that. It's not you're either a capitalist or a socialist. There's this whole spectrum of in-between positions. And in fact, it's somewhere in the middle that is the best position to have. So extreme socialism is on one end of the spectrum. Extreme socialism would be like the USSR, the Soviet Union, where the government owns everything. It owns the means of production. It's the one that pays everybody, and you have extremely high taxes because the government runs everything. I don't think that works very well. It didn't work, as far as I know. It hasn't really worked well in the Soviet Union. It hasn't, and of course, when Russia reestablished itself, Russia is a very capitalist place right now. It's not that at all. Didn't really work in Cuba. It didn't work in Eastern Europe. I don't think the Chinese people thrive. In fact, China has pulled back a little bit on that socialism, realizing that money actually, that there's more thriving when money is in the equation. So extreme socialism doesn't work. I would argue for a mixed approach. A mixed approach, there are two different kind of in the middle here. You can have a mixed approach that is a little bit more socialist, and you have a mixed approach that is a little bit more capitalist. Hold that thought, because I want to go to the other end. So the other extreme is extreme capitalism. That's where society ends up more or less controlled by a few filthy rich individuals. I think that's what we have with the oligarchy in Russia right now. You have a few people who control everything. And I fear that that's where the current administration here in September of 2020 would like to take America as well, where you have a few oligarchs in America who are filthy rich and they run everything. Maybe we have the appearance of democracy, or maybe we have the appearance of the people mattering, but really it's these really filthy rich people who are running the show. So I would say that both extreme socialism and extreme capitalism are not in any way desirable, and both of them end up being oppressive. And so that puts us somewhere in the middle, either in a government that is a little bit more socialist or a government that is a little bit more capitalist. And this is where I would be personally, a little bit more capitalist, where the government controls some things, but not most things. So here we can see some of the differences between some of the more progressive parts of the Democratic Party would be a little bit more socialist. But again, it could be in the middle. So there would be nothing wrong with having a universal healthcare system. You know, that's not a horrible thing. Again, America will have to iron those things out in the future. We have a police, right? What are the police? The police are a government-controlled regulation of human behavior. Again, there's lots of debates about the police, but I think having the police is a good idea in general, right? Because they're the ones that enforce the social contract. But there's not a, this is the Christian answer on this. I think that in the middle here, we're most going to fulfill Christian values, but you can't say, oh, Christian is obviously going to be extreme capitalism. Not at all. That Bible won't support that. Bible would more support extreme socialism than extreme capitalism. But I think that in general, we're most likely to have a thriving society, a more loving your neighbor society, if we're somewhere here in the middle. Well, I welcome you, as I used to tell my classes, feel free to disagree, but this has been a video on economic philosophy.